right. Hello, everyone. You have made it to the end. It is our last class today. Thank you for joining us. We're happy you're here. We're going to talk about community development. And then after that, it's a free-for-all for any last remaining questions. Just as a reminder, you will get a feedback form coming from OLLI about the class. Our intent is to teach this class again. So any feedback you give us, we will take that into consideration to make this offering even better the next time. Like I said, today we are talking about community development. So we have Brandon Goldman, our community development director, as well as his team. So like the times before, we are going to let him drive the show with his team, let them get through their presentation, and then at the end we will do Q&A, and we can do Q&A in the chat box, or you can raise your hands, and we will go from there. So thank you, ComDev team, for being here, and Brandon, I will let you take it from here.
Thank you, Sabrina, and nice to see you all, or at least via Zoom. I'm Brandon Goldman, Community Development Director for City of Ashland. And joining us today, I do have 3 additional staff members, Stephen Matiaco, who's our building official, Derek Severson, who is our planning manager, and Linda Reed, who is our housing program specialist. The reason those 3 are joining us is because we do have a department that covers a lot of ground, namely all development within the City of Ashland, starting from planning for future development to units being built to the inspections along the way and efforts along for housing and code compliance as well. And with that, I'm going to start by sharing my screen to go over the presentation that we've prepared. So let me know if that's visible. I hope so. So going through this, I'm going to try and speak briefly on each division. I know Sabrina indicated saving questions for the end, but because we do have planning and then building and then housing as our prominent components, if you have questions at those stages, we'd be happy to take them. And so with that, again, I just identified those are the different divisions within our department. And it all starts with people coming into our front counter. So even though they're not on the call with us, I wanted to introduce our front counter staff because they're the first point of contact for public. If you wanted to build anything as small as a fence to doing a large annexation and subdivision, coming into our counter is really the first step. And so our front counter is cross-jurisdictional. They help people in all the different divisions. And we often work with interdepartmentally other departments within the city to ensure internal coordination so that we don't have to send you from office to office for answers. I'm going to start by talking about long-range planning, which is hard to see on the ground because it really is a process that begins much further back in terms of looking at what the how we envision our city and what we want it to be. And so through that process, we develop land use ordinance, which are zoning standards, a comprehensive plan, transportation system plans, standards for what buildings need to look like, et cetera. And so the long-range planning process, I'm going to use an example. Many of you are probably familiar with the North Mountain neighborhood and Mountain Meadows. So this area all started back in the late 90s. With a vision from a property owner, a developer out there, Madeline Hill, who was looking at the need for senior housing in the area. So looking at that area in 1994, you can see it was really a blank slate. There was North Mountain Road, which was a dirt road at that time, leading out to Servit, and a lot of vacant property on either side. Started a larger neighborhood planning process to look at what that neighborhood could look like in 1996. This engaged a lot of public meetings, property owners in the area, and ultimately through that planning process, developed what's called the North Mountain Neighborhood Plan. And so this document, again, adopted in November of 96, envisioned how the area would develop with a mix of housing, walkable neighborhoods, alley orientation for vehicles to reduce cars coming directly off the street and create a walkable pedestrian area, having a center green common area for the neighborhood, a mix of housing, housing types, as well as commercial development were also envisioned for the area. And so a lot of illustrative plans were put into that document to kind of guide future developments as what is expected to be seen. And then over the coming years, we started to see that built out. Here you can see in 1998, the Mountain Meadows portion to the east of Normal Neighborhood and the development of, I'm sorry, the east of North Mountain Avenue and the development of North Mountain Avenue occurred. Fast forward another decade, these processes, I want to clarify, are not a quick undertaking. Once it's planned, it doesn't develop within the year. The absorption of this much development in a community our size that gets between 50 and 100 units a year doesn't happen all at once. And additionally, I think in 2008, 2009, there was a recession, so most development stalled in this area. But you can see at this point, by 2011, the road network that was envisioned in that original illustration is largely in place. And the housing units are beginning to follow. Not a lot of development between 2011 and 2016, although the first portions of the Bear Creek Park or the park along Bear Creek were put in. Again, that's a community benefit as part of the subdivision. That was one of those negotiated issues through the master planning process. By 2020, much more of the road network is developed. The housing has begun to fill in. We're seeing some commercial development that has occurred. And when I turn it over to Derek, he's going to focus in on how a particular commercial development did occur, and that moves to the current planning phase. So each of these developments in this area does involve further review, planning commission review to ensure that it's consistent with that master plan, the underlying zoning, and then the build out follows, and at which point the building department gets involved to make sure it's built according to code. So here we are in 2024. I think this was June of this year, and you can see that it is largely complete. There's a hole in the middle in terms of an area that is yet to be developed, but we actually did get an application for that component, which was expected to be multifamily, just this last month, and it's likely to go to the Planning Commission on December 10th. So with that, that's really shows how a larger area develops over the course of 30 years. And so long-range planning is not a one and done situation. We're always long-range planning for the next project that comes along the line. Subsequent to this, we did a plan for the Normal Neighborhood area, which is the area south of East Main between the railroad tracks and East Main Street. We haven't seen any development activity begin out there, but when it does, there's an underlying plan to help guide that growth. Additionally, we have a developer that's interested in doing a similar master plan to the North Mountain neighborhood area for the Croman Mill site, a 61-acre property that was a former mill. And so that's something you may have seen pop up in the news here and again, and we're anticipating, again, an application before the city where the Planning Commission can evaluate changes of use there. And here's the mixed use residential commercial component of the North Mountain neighborhood plan. And again, I think Derek's going to touch on that a little bit. And I can move on to current planning unless there's any questions about long range planning that you guys have at this point. All right, so it's over to you, Derek.
Okay, as Brandon mentioned, I'm Derek Severson, the planning manager. I'm going to talk about current planning, which is really the division that's looking at taking that master plan vision and implementing it as it relates to current projects. So current planning staff includes myself, Aaron Anderson, our senior planner, Jennifer Chenoweth, and Veronica Allen, who are both associate planners. Go to the next slide, Brandon. And one of the primary duties of our group is staffing commissions. So we staff the Public Art Commission that was responsible for that new crosswalk near the entrance to Lithia Park. We staff the Tree Management Advisory Committee. We staff Historic Commission or Historic Preservation Advisory Committee, and we staff the Planning Commission. And all of those sort of look at both current development proposals and broader visions for the city on a volunteer basis, using the expertise of volunteers to advise the Planning Commission and Council. Next slide. As Brandon mentioned, we take these master plan visions like the North Mountain Neighborhood Plan and try to apply those to development on the ground. Next slide. So here, that commercial mixed use core in purple that was visualized in the master plan and then subsequently incorporated into a subdivision proposal. Next slide. Which is the Meadowbrook Park development. That area that was purple on the previous slide is here as sort of a civic core comparable to the plaza in downtown. And the piece I'm going to talk about is on the lower left there, that rectangle right there. Next slide. So that piece is adjacent to that central neighborhood plaza green space. And in about 2016, I believe we had an application proposal come in looking at how to develop that parcel. So this is that parcel as it relates to that central space. Next slide. We had a developer come in with a proposal looking to put a building that looks like this on that property. We review that with the developer. Next slide. In looking at that, there's some design standards that the city has implemented that would look for a stronger sense of entry and a relationship to the corner. So the red on the upper left there was discussed with the applicant as sort of where they should be a little more focused in their building design. So staff met with them and explained that. Next slide. We showed them some examples of sort of comparable development situations. These are all from Orenco Station, showing sort of a stronger corner orientation. The slide on the left or on the right side here is an illustration of how a public parking lot might better relate to the street than just having a blank nondescript wall by having some, wire screens with something semi-artistic to better relate to the pedestrian streetscape. So next slide. So we went from that top design to the bottom feature that really, again, relates much better to the central open space, as well as some artistic screens along that parking area on the bottom floor. Next slide. So from this, we went to the next slide of a vision that sort of reflected the city's ordinances and planned vision. And then to the next slide, that's what resulted on the ground. And that's sort of the current planning process, going through land use actions in the Planning Commission to actually make the land use ordinances and master plans materialize into the built environment. Next slide. And we're on to Stephen Madiaco, the building.
Yeah, and before we go on to Stephen, I see that there was a question in the chat that there is undeveloped property south or east of Mountain Meadows that's within the urban growth, that is within the urban growth boundary. How is it zoned? Mountain Meadows itself, the area to the east of it, is not within the urban growth boundary. So that has a county zoning. There is land within the North Mountain neighborhood along Bear Creek that is within the city limits, and it's bounded by development on all sides. That is part of the North Mountain neighborhood plan and is anticipated to come in as a single family housing development with an extension of roads to connect over to Mountain Avenue in that location, North Mountain, as well as an extension of the parkway through that large vacant property to the south of the developed portion. But again, the portion to the east of Mountain Meadows is all currently vacant. There's as you go further, you get to I-5. That is all outside the urban growth boundary. The urban growth boundary, for those that don't know, is an estimation of where we anticipate to grow over the next 20 years. So the urban growth boundary, although Ashland has not amended its urban growth boundary in the sense it was originally drawn, instead focusing on accommodating growth within the city limits and looking at density, essentially going up rather than out. It could come to a point in time where we've consumed all the land within the developable area within the city. And I think that portion east of Mountain Meadows would be a good candidate to look at expansion of the urban growth boundary and then zoning that at that point in time. But a bigger public process and not one that's we've done yet. So with that, I'll turn it over to our building official, Stephen Madiaco, to talk a bit about the building division and what the work that they do. So you're muted, Stephen?
Thank you, Brandon. As Brandon said, I'm Steve Madiaco. I'm the building official here for the City of Ashland, and I'm just going to give just a little brief review of what we do here at the building department, a little bit of history on it, how codes are applied and created, and yeah, just kind of our role here in the building department. So for those of you new that do or don't know anything about building codes, they're not new by any means. They're actually been around for probably nearly 4,000 years. The original Hammurabi's code is the furthest dating back building code that we're aware of, that we know. And so the introduction to new building codes, they're typically driven by tragic events such as earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods or fires, plagues, things of that nature. And so to get a little interactive here, because anyone in the audience here tell me what they think the most common event that has driven the most building codes into place today. Anybody?
Flooding.
Flooding.
Fire.
Okay. Fire. Anybody else?
Floods.
Floods. Okay. That's 2 for floods. Okay. So fires. So fires is the most biggest disaster that has helped drive and develop building codes over the years. So starting back in, I would say 64 AD, when Rome was burnt up, that really led to the rebuilding of Rome, when they really emphasized setbacks for fire setbacks, fire resistant construction, and sanitation, and just the usefulness and layout of buildings. And then followed by that, we have in the 12th century, there was the first Great Fire of London that occurred, which led to another enhancement of building codes. And then in the 13th century, there was the Black Plague in Europe, which led to an emphasis more on sanitation. And then in 1666, where nearly 2/3 of London burnt up. And then eventually America was discovered, cities were built and also destroyed. There's a report from NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, that covers major recorded fires, over 20 major recorded fires that happened within the timeline of 1865 to 1984 that claimed the lives of over 12,000 people. So it's pretty significant. Next slide, please. Okay, our slides are a little bit out of order. So from what I've recently put together here. So Brandon, could I get you to go forward to the ones with all the codes in them?
Sorry, Stephen, this is the.
There to go. There, that's it. It's the second one right there. Actually, it's right after. Next slide.
So we're off. I'm showing the Hammurabi.
Yeah, go to the next slide after that. It looks like we just skipped over it. Okay, there we go.
Okay.
Okay, great. So what you're looking at there is our bookshelf of older codes that were applied in the past under different administrations that cover building code, fire code, mechanical, electric over years, I think dating back into the 70s. And so a little background on, code development and process and how we how we administer our codes here. So Oregon mandates building codes through rule and statute at a state level. So it's not like Ashland just makes up its own building codes. And initially, these codes, they're developed at a national level through the ICC, the International Code Council. And these codes are known as the model code. So this is like pretty much the whole nation, and internationally also, some countries go off of this model code. And then Oregon, what it does is it takes that code and then it kind of makes its own tweaks to it, but it uses the same layout for it. All the chapters and layout are the same, but there's some things that they want to change just to make and modify to the Oregon needs. So outside of the state mandated codes, we can adopt some codes at a local adopt level, but we're restricted to what we can adopt by state mandate. And the state has what they call a mini max code, which means it's a code minimum. So, and then you basically, you can't enforce more than what the code is. So that basically that is the maximum that you can enforce, is the minimum code level that they set. Now that doesn't mean that as a homeowner or a building owner that you can't build or design things above that code minimum. You can, we just can't require that at a local level, anything more than what the state mandates.
So Stephen, we do have a question in the chat related to building code. Specifically, given the threat of fire, why are buildings still being made of wood?
Well, that's a great question. Affordability, I would say. So there's the balance, right? We want to have safe buildings, but they still have to be affordable too. So, and there's a lot of interested parties that are influential in the development of code as well, like the National Home Builders Association, that really push for affordability. So there's different types of construction. Mainly in the commercial code, they break down the different types that are based on, fire resistance and levels. And based on that type of construction, the more fire resistant and structural sound they are, the larger that they will allow that building to be. So wood buildings are limited to size. So
Yeah,
does that answer your question?
I'll note on that, just to elaborate, Stephen, if I may, is that the city of Ashland recently passed an allowance under state building code to adopt fire resistant building codes at the local level. And those they allow wood, but they require such things as wrapping eaves or using ignition resistant materials such as fencing, vegetation management around buildings. So this is something that the city of Ashland voluntarily approved in 2018, 2019, in advance of the Alameda fire. And so I think that one issue that we have to recognize is that a source of, somebody's home burning down isn't necessarily wildfire from forests, but it could be the house next door catching on fire. And so if we can deal with the fuel between the buildings, namely highly flammable vegetation, if we can ensure that the eaves aren't exposed in such a way as that they will be easily caught on fire, those are minor changes that can be made in the development of a building without a lot of substantial cost that helps reduce the fire risk at a local level. Sorry for interjecting, but I'll let.
No, thank you, Brandon. That's great. And that's for currently all residential structures, new residential structures within the city of Ashland are required to be built under that ignition resistant, but they can be built of wood. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on if there's no other questions at this time. So we're talking about the codes right now and the adoption process and what we can the mini max, what we can require. And so of these codes, there's a handful of codes that we administer and regulate. They include residential code, structural code, mechanical codes, electrical code, plumbing code, energy efficiency code. And then all of these codes have standards that they scope and reference out of the code that we go to see how they want these certain assemblies built and put together. And so these codes on the international level, the model code, they do code changes every 3 years. And then Oregon also does code updates on a 2 to 3 year cycle update. And they typically take the residential portions of the code and they split them up from the commercial so that we're not updating them all at once. So we'll see anywhere from between, usually within every couple years, we're going to see new codes that we have been adopted to the state level that are mandated for us to enforce. So with that comes continuing education classes that the state offers that they require us to take through them. That maintains our certification, that shows that we're up to date with what these new codes are, and we're assessing and reviewing plans to those standards. Next slide, please. Let's see, I think we're back one, Brandon. There we go. Thank you. Okay, so through the community development department, our building safety department offers a full service building and safety division where we provide comprehensive plan review, permit issuance, and inspections for all areas of constructions, including what we just talked about, the structural, electrical, plumbing, and mechanical portions, and energy efficiency. And so, staff doesn't just review, approve, and do inspections. They're also part of local chapters that promote code consistency, code committees that work on code development, standardized forms. So we have our local ICC chapters, which is our Southern Oregon International Code chapter that has groups anywhere from Coos County and Douglas County down to Klamath County. With that, we have architects, engineers, contractors that join in there as well. And our main goal is just to provide code consistency and education and keep everybody up to date and have good, times for question and answer. We also do outreach, for bringing people into this industry and educating them on the different opportunities that there are in the industry. Next slide, please. So once we've got the plans in, we've done the review, we've reviewed them for whatever the current code compliance is for those different systems, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, structural. We then issue the permits, and we follow up with inspections to make sure that the projects are being built, as they were designed and approved to be built. Next slide, please. So duties of the building department. So building codes are intended to provide a minimum level of safety. That's what they're intended for. So properly written codes require that buildings and structures are designed, built, used, and maintained in the manners provided safety, which reduces the risk to the human life to an acceptable minimum, is what they say. That's the jargon used. So it is the building department's duty and responsibility to ensure that anything that is constructed must contain these basic safety elements. So the building department has the duty and the power to enforce all ordinances and laws regulating construction on private and public property by providing services such as the plan review, permit issuance, and inspections. During the plan check for like structural components, we'll look at the foundation sizing, the reinforcement, like the rebar that's being placed in it, structural bracing for lateral, from wind and seismic events, header sizes, roof snow loads, floor loads. And then there's calculations also that are put together for seismic and wind force resisting systems that we need to check to make sure that the minimum design requirements are met, so that in a case that we have one of those events, that the building can withstand it at least long enough to help get the occupants out of the building safely. They're not necessarily always designed to make it through, but more so to provide time to get occupants out of the building safely. Okay, let's see. So we covered structural during the plan review and inspection. So there's other parts outside of the structural, which include life safety items, which are, major check items that we look at. So components such as smoke and carbon monoxide detection, emergency and escape rescue openings and sleeping rooms, main egress, exiting doors, garage dwelling, fire separations, look at fire rated construction, fire alarms and fire protection systems such as sprinkler suppression. Other fire and life and safety components would include guardrails and handrails, landing, stairs, ramp requirements, just to assure that people aren't falling down and hurting themselves, and we don't have 12-inch steps or a 12-inch step with a 6-inch step that'll kind of throw your walk off. So just consistency in that manner. And then in the commercial and multifamily structures, there's a thing called accessibility, which we also review for compliance. And accessibility is similar to ADA standards. It's the term used in the building code that scopes and controls the design and construction of the facilities for accessibility for the individuals that have disabilities and need the accessible features. So looking at everything we've talked about, so what are some of the possibilities you could think of that could happen when buildings aren't built to code and proper inspections don't take place? They're not built to design. This will be another little interactive part if you guys want to get involved. Think of anything, some of the consequences of not designing and building to building codes. Okay.
A balcony can fall down
There
if
you
it's
go.
not structurally sound.
Sure. Sure, in the
roofing
event
pavement?
of overloaded by snow or earthquake or even a big wind event, yeah, I could push that over and hurt somebody that was in the area or even on it. Okay. Well,
Electrical fires.
electrical fires, you bet. Absolutely.
Somebody can trip on an improper stair or something like that.
Yeah, and that actually happens quite often.
Well, that looks that looks like a little bit more of a failure than a balcony.
Right. Okay, yeah. Yeah,
And
so
is that
so
flooding? Flooding the
no,
line?
well, this actually is, I believe this is Shanghai, China. And there's a few things going on here with this building. One is, I believe the helical piers that you see sticking out of the bottom, those did not meet, they were actually outlawed and did not meet the current code standards. So they were lacking inspections on that. And then they ended up excavating too close to the building, and they didn't have proper drainage. So if you look to the right of that picture, there's a river there too. And so when they're doing their excavation, they didn't have the proper drainage in place to prevent water from coming through there. So they didn't have, the building was basically sitting on a bunch of water that was intruded in through from the river. And luckily only one person was killed in that event, but it was still, that's one person is too much in my opinion. And then of course you've got that whole building laying on its back now. So I'm not sure what the recovery for that is, but yeah, that That's not a good situation. Next slide, please. So other roles that our building department plays is would be in the disaster and emergency planning. So as far as situations like 97 flood or the Alameda fire that just happened recently, what is the role that the building department has in these disaster emergency responses? Well, under the authority of the Oregon State Fire Marshal Office, building inspectors can get certified to help assess and assist in assessment damage that can assist with determining if and when it's safe or not to occupy structures affected by these disaster incidents. So what we did in the Alameda fire, I think there was over 2,200 structures that were lost. And so there was a combination of building inspectors and fire staff and IT departments going around and documenting all this. And it was the documentation is needed to happen in a timely response so that organizations such as FEMA can actually do their part to help with the recovery. So yeah, so we assist in that, and it's really important for us to be prepared and have these certifications so that when these disaster emergency moments happen, that we're ready to go out and respond and help people get back into their homes and recover sooner. So that's all I have for my portion of the presentation. Are there any questions that I could take at this time? All right. Well, thank you very much. And I believe we'll move on to Linda Reed or back to Brandon to moderate.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. We did have a couple questions in the chat that related to planning, and I see that Derek Severson has been answering those. So Sabrina, if you want us to go over those for the group, we can do so. Essentially, the questions about, the city street standards. I think we do have standards that try and reduce the amount of asphalt that is utilized within the city for stormwater runoff. And it's always a balance of, protecting the environment, providing accessible streets for vehicles and emergency vehicles. All of our street standards were reviewed by the fire department in advance of their being approved in our street standards to ensure that fire apparatus could access those areas. And it does often, you'll see in what are called skinny streets in Ashland, cars parked on both sides, which can constrain the traffic flow. In part, that's by design. The effort is to slow traffic by creating what's called queuing streets, where driveways are offset so that in some cases only one car can pass at a time. So again, I think that on higher arterial streets that need to move a lot of cars, that's not the case. They have unobstructed lanes and either no parking on either side or very wide lanes and bike lanes as well that help facilitate things like evacuation. On internal city streets or neighborhood streets, they may be a little bit more constrained, but again, that's in an effort to try and reduce the amount of asphalt. I don't know if that answers your question, Ann, on that. And then there was a question about the development of a multifamily apartment complex on the north side of town off of Highway 99. We did have an application for a 220 unit development. That went through the planning department and the city council and was approved and then appealed at the state level. Ultimately, the applicant withdrew that application, but they are resubmitting that application to go back through that process. So although it was controversial in terms of the street right-of-way improvements and the affordability, the applicant would be providing affordable housing per our requirements. And I think Ashland might be unique in the state in actually requiring affordable housing for annexations into the city, where we require up to 25% of the units be affordable to low or moderate income households. So that is unique within the state, but we see that as annexation imparts a lot of value on the property, that's the time to see that affordable housing as a component of that development, which would be the case on that Grand Terrace project as well. And lastly, there was a question about building heights being 3 stories in Ashland. I will note that there's 4-story buildings in Ashland that, for instance, the dormitories at SOU, and then if you go way back, the Elks Building or the Ashland Springs Hotel in the downtown. So buildings taller than 3 stories is allowable. In many cases, we have a 45-foot height maximum. You could squeeze 4 stories. I know that through cost, often 3 stories is more attainable for developers because they don't have to install an elevator or something along those lines, which can be cost prohibitive. But we are looking at the areas of the railroad property, an area along Ashland Street as allowing heights of up to 50 feet and eliminating density requirements so you could have more smaller units in the same 3-dimensional building. So these are kind of strategies that get to that going up instead of out. And it, a distinction between a 4-story building and a 3-story building is probably not that great when standing on the sidewalk in front of it, but it does provide for additional housing opportunities. So something we should look at. Otherwise, the state would be looking that we need to accommodate that housing in some manner, and expansion into farmlands or forest lands would be the only other alternative. And Ashland is constrained in terms of steep slopes on our south side, floodplains on our north side. I-5 is another major barrier to growth. So again, trying to accommodate that growth rate inside the city limits. So I hope I answered those questions. I think Derek probably did a better job in the chat for those that want to read it. But I'm going to move on to code compliance. It's another division within our department. And when I say division, it's a division of one person. So it's actually a shared responsibility for many different departments, handle code compliance. If it's a weed abatement issue, I'm sure the fire department noted in their presentation that they do quite a bit of outreach to ensure those weeds are kept down during fire season. Cars parked in the public right-of-way that are abandoned, that streets department would pick that up and run with it. So our code compliance officer works in part as a referral, and once receiving complaints from the city. And I don't know that this website is active yet, but the city is looking at initiating a C-click fix, where if you see issues like illegal trash dumping in the public right-of-way, that you can report it to the city and it will get routed to the appropriate person. We also take phone calls. Our office is open every day, so if somebody comes in to file a complaint, they can do so. And a complaint is really the first step in doing an investigation of whether or not there is a violation of our code. Some complaints we receive that, my neighbor's tree is growing over my property line. It's a complaint, it's a concern. It may be dropping branches on your property, but that's a civil issue between neighbors. So what happens is our community development department might reach out to that neighbor and say, your neighbor has this concern, but if it's not a violation, it doesn't progress beyond that. Some violations that we do see with some regularity is, track out or dirt in the public right-of-way, abandoned vehicles or junk in the front yard, or junk being put in the public right-of-way. You see a lot of free signs on things that no one's going to pick up. That could very well be a code compliance issue. Building division touched on it. We also see code violations in terms of building code. The picture on the right here is likely was a grow room with a number of timers set up for individual lights to grow marijuana within a garage. That not only is a violation of our marijuana rules, which allow for a certain number of plants to be grown for personal use, but beyond that runs into electrical violation of code and could result in a fire. And so those are that public safety type code violation that we need to take very seriously. We also receive comments about illegal dwelling units, and as housing becomes less and less attainable, I think these kind of complaints are more prominent, more prevalent, and understandable in some cases. But there is really a rationale buildings such as that are shown here as RVs, they're not really built for permanent residency, as the door it's got a singular door and a kitchen between. If the building catches fire or has issues like that, it really is not intended to be used as full-time living and our codes locally don't allow for it. Additionally, we receive unlicensed short-term rentals. You know, again, I think this is the flip side of our housing affordability. We have a relatively rigid code in terms of when someone can do a traveler's accommodation. Many towns just allow Airbnbs outright. Somebody can rent out their house. In Ashland, we only allow that in multifamily zones and only after going through a planning approval process called a conditional use permit. And so these kind of units being used in houses without approval can take existing housing stock off the market for residences and as such drive up housing costs. So that is a code compliance issue that, again, cyclically we deal with more in summer than this time of year. Backyard farming, you wouldn't think is keeping of animals would normally seem to be an issue for most, but you know, a loud rooster can disturb a neighborhood and we'll get phone calls and respond, because we did establish allowances for urban farming, including keeping of bees, keeping of micro livestock, small goats, but not full cows, those kind of things. So people can, you know, grow some of their own food as well as have some animal husbandry on site, even in small lot residential areas. But there are limits that were established through our public process. And so if those are breached, we'll contact the property owner and let them know what those are. Part of what I'm aiming at saying is that we really do look at code compliance as trying to work between neighbors to find solutions, as that is ultimately the best remedy. But in those cases where there's a violation and a property owner that is non-responsive to our compliance effort, it does switch to an enforcement effort. And as these are code requirements, they can result in citations and going before the municipal judge with a notice to appear to have it adjudicated. So that's really the code compliance division. If you had any questions on that aspect, I'd be happy to answer them, or we can turn it over to housing. All right, so Linda, you're up. And Linda Reed is our housing program manager. And I'm sure she's the most astute at answering any question relating to our housing programs. So I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you, Brandon. Hi, my name is Linda Reed, and I am the Housing Program Manager for the City of Ashland. And I hope it is not new news to any of you that the City of Ashland does indeed have a housing program. It is a very small housing program. We aim to be comprehensive. I think our program has evolved over time. It's always evolving as needs change and the housing landscape changes. I think that we evolve so that our program can be more workable and continue to be viable and produce the needed housing units that we've identified. So we should go to the next slide, sorry. At its most basic level, the city's housing program consists of a series of financial incentives and regulatory land use regulations that compel or incentivize needed housing types. So the city's housing program does do research and analysis on housing needs and existing housing stock. And we use that information and data to inform our program. We develop policies using best practices, using examples from other cities, things that have worked well in other cities, to try to incentivize those housing types that have a recognized need. And sometimes that recognized need is affordability, sometimes it is accessibility, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. Oh. So I think that this is always a hot topic. We hear the words affordable housing a lot, but people often don't know what that means. There is an actual definition for what affordable housing is. It was created by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And it is essentially that any household does not pay more than 30% of their income toward housing costs. If you are paying more than 30% of your income toward housing costs, HUD considers that a housing cost burden. If you are paying more than 50% of your income toward housing costs, HUD considers that an extreme cost burden. And essentially what that means is that if you're paying more than 30 or 50% of your income towards your housing costs, then you have much less income to address emergent needs or other needs that allow you to live life, like transportation and health and medications. And that if you are cost burdened, then you run the risk of becoming homeless or being precariously housed. So each community has an income guideline that is provided by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. There are other income guidelines from different departments, but the City of Ashland chooses to use the Department of Housing and Urban Development's income guidelines to be consistent with other funding that we receive, and I'll talk a little bit about that funding, and also to be consistent with the state and federal funding that comes down to the cities through different affordable housing programs financed by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So it's just a consistency piece. And there's some examples on this slide of what those income levels are. HUD defines our income group as the Medford statistical area. It is the same as the county. So Jackson County, Medford, and Ashland all have the same income guidelines. They are not different. So the city's housing program deed restricts units through trust deeds and resale restriction covenants to rent and sell to households that are within certain income guidelines, predominantly moderate income, sometimes low income, and in certain cases, but not as many, a median income or 120%, which is a little above median. Currently, there are approximately 239 units that are regulated by the city that have been incentivized or required through the city's housing program and that are deed restricted to rent or sell to homeowners within these income brackets and at a price that is below market that the city sets. Next slide. So these are just some examples. There's of all the things that the city's housing program does. So obviously we work with affordable housing providers to help develop needed housing types, including affordable housing types and rental housing types. But the city also, the city's housing program also addresses human service needs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I think the main points about this are that we recognize that access to housing is an issue that people face. So having housing types that are commensurate with your community's needs are important, whether you have rental housing, ownership housing, and the levels of affordability for those housing types. But if you have barriers to accessing that housing, then we try to address those items as well. And we do that in a couple of different ways. One of the ways that we do that is through supporting the social service grant program. So the social service grant program is overseen by the housing program, and the Housing and Human Services Commission reviews and makes recommendations on funding those applicants. In this last year, we awarded $134,000 to 15 different recipients who provide essentially barrier removal and or supports, hopefully to help people stabilize and get into housing, but that can look like a lot of different things. The housing program also collaborates with regional partners, sometimes to address issues of homelessness, sometimes to address other issues such as access to housing and fair housing. Certainly, you know, within the realm of the work that the city does, we don't do direct services. We don't provide direct services to individuals who are needing employment supports, mental health, medical, those sorts of things. But we do work with partners and we support them through funding and partnership and collaboration and education and outreach, so that the people who are needing those things can get those resources, and hopefully that will help them either get into housing or stabilize in housing or just stabilize in life in general. Next slide. So this is a great slide. I think it's a great slide because I think it really encompasses the work of the housing program in a really comprehensive way. Obviously, housing is a complex issue in any community, and not any less so than in Ashland. And it takes a multi-pronged approach to address all of the issues that are encompassed within housing needs. And as I mentioned previously, a piece of that is access to housing. How do people stabilize to get into housing? How do people address discrimination in housing transactions? How do people address making reasonable accommodations in their housing if they have differing abilities and needs because of those differing abilities? So a big piece of this, and I think this is really important, and I'm sure you all do too, is public education. And that is the role of the Housing and Human Services Advisory Committee. They are tasked with providing community engagement and community outreach, and that can look like a variety of things. It can look like fair housing trainings to landlords and to tenants so that they understand their rights and responsibilities as a tenant, and just as landlords have rights and responsibilities to their tenants as a business owner. It can provide education materials about resources available in the community to help get you into housing, or address how do you get reasonable accommodations made. Another thing that the Housing and Human Services Commission has done is education about special needs populations, including homeless populations, peoples with severe persistent mental illness, DD populations, peoples with developmental disabilities. And then lastly, they can often address issues of NIMBYism. And NIMBYism is an interesting one because it isn't necessarily about tenants, but more about obstructions or barriers to the development of needed housing types, such as affordable housing. So within the purview of the housing program is also land use initiatives. There are a number of areas that the housing program provides land use opportunities and incentives, and some of which are voluntarily required. So in cases, I think Brandon mentioned earlier that the city has an annexation ordinance that in certain circumstances can require affordability in newly annexed properties. And in cases where properties may want to change their zone to have more density or build more housing, the city also offers a bonus density to developers to create affordable housing and offset the costs with market rate housing. The City of Ashland used to be more unique than it is with system development charge deferral. So many cities are offering those as well. I think the City of Ashland, and Brandon or Derek could correct me if I'm wrong, we were one of the first cities to approve a cottage housing ordinance. We have some differing regulations to make it easier to develop accessory residential units. So there's a lot of really innovative things that the city has done over the years to incentivize needed housing types, which could be at a lower cost point and could promote rental housing. The other big piece of the affordable housing program are the grants and financial incentives. So as I mentioned before, the City of Ashland is an entitlement jurisdiction for community development block grants, or at least I hope I mentioned it. I meant to. The city became an entitlement jurisdiction in 1994. And so we receive a direct allocation of community development block grant funds from the Department of Housing and Urban Development each year. And that funding is meant to provide resources for community development, which could include infrastructure, services, and housing. And we also have an affordable housing trust fund, which is a pretty unique thing. We've had one since 2008, and it has been continuously funded since 2014 with marijuana tax revenues. It's about $200,000 every other year, so $100,000 a year, but we only offer it every other year. And it can be used for a variety of uses, including capacity building for affordable housing providers, which is very needed because we have limited capacity in our community, and the development of affordable housing, pre-development costs, some things that community development block grants can't fund. And it also goes up to 120% of area median income, which is a recognized needed housing gap. Oh, I think I'm supposed to move on. So I will move on. And so in 2023, the City of Ashland was the first community to adopt a housing production strategy in the state of Oregon. And the housing production strategy is essentially 15 action items that the city adopted to be explored and potentially implemented over the course of 8 years. There's a number of items which are land use in nature. Some are more programmatic, like land banking or land trusts, or the equitable housing plan. And so the city is working its way through that. Like I said, we adopted it in 2023. We have 8 years to explore and implement each of these actions, which is approximately 2 actions a year. Okay, next slide. Oh, we talked a lot about the education and outreach. This is a great picture of a housing forum that the Housing and Human Services Commission held. Gosh, it was several years ago now. Was well attended. We have a number of brochures and studies that we provide regarding housing needs in our community, data on housing needs, and ways that the city works to address those needs. And these are just examples of some of the housing units that have been built and deed restricted through the city's program. Some of them are ownership units and some of them are affordable rental housing units, because there is a recognized need for both housing types. Next slide. More housing. So I am happy to answer any questions that you may have. I see that while I've been talking, there have been some questions posted in the chat, and I haven't really had a chance to look at those because I can't talk and read at the same time. So let's see here. I see that, I don't know, Brandon, have you had a chance? It looks like Derek has answered some of these as well.
Sure, I'll touch on the manufactured homes, as there was a couple questions in terms of that. The city is, as Linda identified, one of the housing production strategies was to look at our existing manufactured home parks and create a manufactured home park zone. The intent of that would be to remove some of the development pressure on those properties to change into larger scale multifamily unit developments, and as such ensure that they stay as a needed housing type, which manufactured home parks as an ownership housing is one. I will clarify that it doesn't really address the issue in terms of the individual space rents that are charged to manufactured homeowners going up. That is a market issue between a property owner and the residents of a manufactured home park. There are solutions to that. They do fall outside of land use and fall outside of the city's role, but essentially resident-owned communities are a good way for a group in a manufactured home park to collectively purchase the park and then set their own rents to ensure that they're high enough to cover ongoing maintenance, infrastructure, repairs, those kind of things, but not escalate as to what the market will bear. The Planning Commission last Thursday went and toured a resident-owned community that's being developed in Talent right now, in a replacement park from one that was burned, the Talent Mobile Estates. And I think that's a great model, and I would hope that in addition to the manufactured home park zone work that we'll be doing as a city, that those residents of those parks look at that as a model and see if it's something that could apply as well. There was a question about cottage housing and what is that? And I think Derek's answered it, but essentially, if, for the longest time, single family residential zone meant that you could put one large house on a larger property. We've changed our code to allow that you can do a secondary unit on any property that allows a single family home, and that's called an accessory dwelling unit. But if there's a larger lot that could accommodate 4 new single family homes, the question was asked, well, could it be feasible that someone could build 8 or more small units on that same property? So we passed what's called a cottage housing ordinance, and it's another case of what's old is new again. Cottage housing developments were very popular in the 20s and 30s, where you have 800 square foot units surrounding a central common green area. And then that got pushed aside for single family detached homes all in a row and subdivisions that you saw in the 70s and 80s. But now there's the opportunity to look at those properties that have yet to develop and see if cottage housing would work for them. We've had, I think, 4, Derek could correct me if I'm wrong, cottage housing developments that have been reviewed, approved, and are either built or in the process of being built since we adopted that ordinance. So it shows there's a market for it, and and it'll accommodate more households on a smaller area of property. That does beg a question that was asked in the chat in terms of, do we have street capacity to accommodate this increasing density that we're seeing? And in large part, the answer is yes, but with a caveat that each application that comes forward, subdivision would have to go through a review of the existing street system in that area, and through a transportation impact analysis, if it's a larger development, demonstrate that if there are any improvements to that street network that need to be made, an intersection enhancement, a turn lane being installed, those kind of things are reviewed and approved as part of the planning action. So I think that kind of covers it.
And I think just to address Anne's question about receptivity to manufactured housing, and I'm not sure if this is what you mean, Anne. I don't think that the city of Ashland is unreceptive to manufactured housing. And this is where it gets to what levers are in control, the city has control over. Like, the city does not control what develops where, right? We can only incentivize it or sort of, provide measures that might compel developers to build a certain thing. We do know that there is a strong desire for manufactured home types as an affordable homeownership option. We have heard that many times when we do community engagement, but it is not an efficient use of land for development. And so when a developer is looking at a piece of land and deciding how to develop it, I think that highest and best use is the most density, and that is not what you get from manufactured homes. And so I think that's kind of illustrates in my mind the challenges that the city has, is that while there may be a desire for a housing type, the city can't compel that type of development. We do a lot of outreach to, obviously, consumers, tenants, and landlords and developers to try to get feedback from them, because that is just not the world that we live in, and we cannot possibly stay on top of all of the lending requirements and the changes in the market. And so, we're always looking for feedback, and I believe that we are receptive to manufactured homes. Whether they get built would not be because the city isn't receptive to them.
Well, that actually concludes our formal presentation. So I'm going to stop the share and see if there's more questions and answers.